So we're going to be taking a look at some SQL Server extensions. Now, extensions are unique to SQL Server, but they are not an official part of the SQL language. So if you use a different piece of software for SQL, chances are it's not going to recognize these extensions. So we are just going to quick go through them so you know what they are. So basically, our scenario is that the boss wants to see a report showing the vendor name, the vendor state, and a count of all of the invoices. And then they want a total of the invoice amounts. And they want to see a total when the vendor state and the names within the state change. So we're first going to code up kind of a regular query, and then we're going to add the clause that is going to give us the totals. So we're going to say use AP, and this is another one where we have to use vendors and invoices. We're going to select vendor state, vendor name. I'm going to count everything, fit an alias of invoice count. And then we're going to sum up invoice total, give that an alias of invoice total. And all of this is coming from invoices. And we got to join with vendors. On invoices dot vendor ID equal to vendors dot vendor ID. And then we're going to do a group by. So we'll say group by vendor state and vendor name. Okay, so all of this is standard. We have not added the SQL Server extension yet. I'm just going to run it kind of like this. Okay, so what you should notice is that we've got the states, we've got the vendors, we've got the invoice count, we have a total. Okay, but what we need is a group by, because the states are all over the place. And the boss did want some subtotaling going on. So we have to add to the group by. We've got vendor state, vendor name. But to get those totals in there, we have to say with rollup. Okay, and with rollup is the clause that is a SQL Server extension. And it's going to give us totals when the state changes, basically. Come down here, you'll notice we've got all California. And then when it goes from California to DC, you'll see that it's giving us a total. Okay, so this is the total count, and this is the total invoice amount. And then it does the same thing for DC, MA, for Michigan. This is the total for Michigan and the total amount. Okay, so it's doing that for each one. The null heading is not ideal. There is a way around that. It involves using a case statement. We haven't learned how to do that yet. So for right now, you're just going to kind of have to live with it. Just realize that there is a way to change it so that it is a little bit more user-friendly. So what we're going to do is comment this out. So we showed the boss the report. They don't like the null that is showing up on the total line. So what we're going to do is make a little change. So instead of using with rollup, we're going to do the same query, and we're going to use a different SQL Server extension. We're going to say with cube instead. And And now we're going to go ahead and run. And you can see what with cube does. We're still getting a null, but now the null is in the state column. And it's basically displaying every single time the vendor name changes. So that's actually not very useful to us. And it's still displaying the null, which the boss really isn't going to be too happy about. So what we're going to do is make a little adjustment. Hopefully it'll make it look a little better. We're going to add vendor city. We're going to take out vendor name. And then at least when the city changes, we will be getting the total instead of when every vendor changes. So let's go ahead and run it. Okay, so that looks maybe a little better. Not ideal still, but until we learn how to use the case structure, we're kind of have to live with it the way it is. So we're going to go ahead and move the closing comment down. So our boss is not sold on with rollup and with cube, but they are curious to see what the output looks like if we use with rollup, with cube, and grouping sets. Wants to see how everything looks, differently. So we decide to run a single query 4 different ways to show our boss what the difference is. So we're going to say use AP, and we're going to do a select on vendor state and vendor city. We'll do a little count of everything, and we'll just say quantity of vendors. And we're going to say from vendors. So we're going to make this simple. We're just going to use the one table. And so the first time we run this, we'll do a group by vendor state, vendor city, and we're going to do with rollup. And then we're going to comment out the other 2 lines. And to save myself some typing, I'm going to copy and paste here. This is going to be with cube. I'll do another paste and comment out. And this is going to be grouping sets. So we're going to say group by grouping sets. And then in parentheses, we're going to give it the columns that we want to group by. And then finally, we're going to do an order by vendor state in descending order and vendor city in descending order. So the first time we run it, it is going to be with rollup. So I'm going to move this up so you can see it. And we'll execute. So with rollup, we've got the null in the vendor city. And then we're going to comment out with rollup. Take the comments out of with cube. And we're going to go ahead and run that. And for this one, basically every time the city changes, we get the null. And now we're going to look at grouping. So let's comment that one out and run the grouping sets. So of the three, at this point, with roll-up looks the best, but there is something that we can do to fix the grouping sets. We seem to have kind of lost our city. So what we can do is say group by grouping sets, and we can say vendor state, comma, and then in parentheses, we're going to say vendor state, comma, vendor city. Okay, so it's going to group by the state, and then within the state, it's going to group by the city, which is actually what we would prefer. So we're going to execute that. Okay, and you will notice that that looks very similar to what you saw with Cube. Okay, now New York, we've got 3 different listings for city. Let's take a look here and see if that's what we got with Cube. And we'll find New York. So it does look very similar. Look at the quantity. Yep. So grouping and Cube have very similar results. So we ran this for the boss, and now they can see what the difference is. They would like us to count the vendors in each state and try using partition by this time. So we're going to move our closing comment down. And so we'll say use AP, select vendor ID and vendor state. And account vendor ID. And you have to say over and then partition by vendor state. So partition by is just kind of how you're grouping. And we're going to give this an alias of total vendors per state. And all this is coming from vendors. And I think you're going to like this output the best because it actually gives us a very user-friendly, readable output. So we're going to go ahead and do an execute. So we're displaying vendor ID and vendor state. We're doing a count of vendor. And we're basically telling it how we want the data organized. So we want it organized by state. And you'll notice that we don't have any of the nulls displaying in our output. So partition by is giving us really nice results. Once we learn how to use the case structure, using with rollup with Cube, grouping sense is not going to be a big deal because we'll be able to replace null with user-friendly text. So looking at this, there is a little tweak that we're going to make because right now we've got our results kind of grouped by state. But what we would like is within state, we want it organized by our vendor IDs. So we're going to add a little order by statement to this. So because we're using partition, we have to add the order by inside the partition statement. So we want to order by, which is sorting, vendor state and vendor ID. And now we're going to go ahead and execute. And especially down here in California, you'll notice that there was quite a change in the vendor IDs. And they're now all in sequential order. And that is what we wanted. So we'll go ahead and comment this out. So far, the commands that we have used basically are used to group our data and give us some type of totals. And what we're going to do next is do a running total of the vendors in the different states. So we're going to use AP for this. And we're going to select vendor ID and vendor state. And we're going to do a count of vendor ID. And now we're going to use the over clause. This is going to give us a running total. And we're going to do order by vendor state, vendor ID. We'll give this a little alias of total vendors per state. And this is all coming from the vendors table. So we're going to see vendor ID, vendor state, and account. And the count is basically going to be organized by vendor state and vendor ID. And so it'll start with Arizona, and it'll go down from there as far as the states go. And it's just going to give us a running total of vendors. So the first vendor is going to be numbered 1. The second vendor is going to be numbered 2. Then the third one is going to be number 3. So we're going to go ahead and run it so you can see what I'm talking about. So here it's organizing by vendor state. Within vendor state, it's looking at the vendors, and it's just giving us a total count. That's all it's doing. Okay, so if we scroll to the bottom, we can see how many vendors we actually have. And that was our last task for the day. So at this point, we're going to hit save, and you are going to turn this in.